Our next panel is on national conveners and advocates, and they'll discuss national resources and tools. And so we're fortunate enough to have Emily Stets of the Aspen Institute, Sarah Axelson from the Women's Sports Foundation, and Russell Pate from the National Physical Activity Plan Alliance. So, Emily?
Good morning, everyone. So as mentioned, my name is Emily Stets, and on behalf of the Aspen Institute Sports and Society program, we'd like to thank the Department of Health and the Office of Disease Prevention and Health Promotion and Lieutenant Commander Piercy's team and the President's Council on Sports, Fitness, and Nutrition for this opportunity to weigh in on such an important issue. Our program functions off of the base knowledge you heard presented this morning by Mo and Dan. Active and healthy kids do better in life, and they stand better prepared to be active participants in life for whatever that looks like for them. We've built our program on this premise. Through our most prominent initiative, Project Play, we develop, share, and apply knowledge to help build healthy communities through sports by focusing first on kids ages 6 to 12. While we're aware, and as was mentioned again this morning, of the many barriers that kids face to getting and staying active, we strongly believe in creating a youth sport ecosystem in which all kids, regardless of age, physical or intellectual disability or ability, gender, race, ethnicity, or zip code, can be active and healthy through sports. And we develop two main kinds of research that we disseminate nationwide and also internationally to help build this ecosystem, the first of which is original research. Our seminal report, Sport for All, Play for Life, a playbook to get every kid in the game, which was co-authored by our program founders and our innovative leaders, without whom I would not be standing on this stage, Tom Ferry, our executive director, and Risa Issard, my predecessor, who's also in the room now in her capacity at Kaboom. And through this report, this is the cornerstone of our program. It provides a framework for multi-sector collaboration to ensure that all kids are active to a healthy level as prescribed by CDC. And it has quickly become one of the most read reports in the history of the Aspen Institute. The playbook offers 8 plays based on the values of health and inclusion, which you can see here, including ask kids what they want, putting kids back at the center of youth sports, reintroducing free play that is more unstructured, encouraging sports sampling. You heard a lot about overuse injuries this morning from Dan and a lot of the work that Mo has done as well. Revitalize in-town leagues, thinking small, as was also mentioned in a question earlier about the spaces where kids actually play. Design for development, especially as kids are moving through different stages of physical development. Train all coaches. And lastly, emphasize prevention. At a high level, this report frames the narrative for nationwide conversation and dialogue surrounding youth sports and barriers to access. To further move forward towards solutions, we narrow the focus of our research from broad, cross-sector strategies to our national state of play reports, which we have conducted over the past 3 years. These reports provide a snapshot of how well stakeholders are serving children and communities through youth sports. So moving from the broad, looking across different sectors, to drilling down specifically here. And these reports from 2016 up through 2018 include the most recent sports participation data and coaching metrics from the Sports and Fitness Industry Association. We talked about data this morning. We know that it's not sufficient right now, but this is what we're using, that we have access to and that is being collected. The State of Play reports also include exclusive analysis of over 40 key developments in sports from the past year and grades in each of Project Play's 8 plays or areas of shared opportunity to look at how well different stakeholders are serving youth in their different areas. In our most recent report, the State of Play 2018, it also identifies next steps in 2019 for how the movement can work to make sport more accessible and affordable to all. Next, to understand how our framework actually plays out on a local level, to drill down from the national strategy to what this looks like in communities, we then provide an even more granular analysis of access to sport and the benefits and challenges that certain communities are facing through our local state of play reports. And as you can see here, we've currently landscaped 6 communities, including Harlem, Baltimore, Southeast Michigan, Western New York, Greater Rochester and the Finger Lakes, and Mobile County, Alabama. In 2019, at our Project Play Summit, we will release and are in the process now of landscaping 2 additional communities, Seattle-King County, and also the entire state of Hawaii. Through this landscaping process, which was based on and inspired by a collective impact methodology of bringing multiple different sectors together to move the arrows toward a common good, we support our partners in mobilizing their leaders, creating shared agendas, and developing mutually reinforcing actions that they can continue and build on after the State of Play reports are released. We help foundations shape grant-making material to align with key tenets related to youth access to sports and connect local groups to national organizations through our network, which lead to new investments and innovative partnerships. And in addition to developing this depth and breadth of original research to ascertain how exactly do we impact the youth sport ecosystem, how do we make a real change, we also develop a variety of tools that we can disseminate that are aggregated on specific topics of research. And there's a couple here, I've tied them to some of our 8 plays. One that was released last year and is tied to play number 3, Encourage Sport Sampling, is the Healthy Sport Index. It was developed in partnership with the Hospital for Special Surgery, and it combines the best available data and expert analysis into the world's first ever tool to assess the relative benefits and risks of participating in the 10 most popular sports for high school boys and girls. Through its interactive design, the Healthy Sport Index is a tool that helps parents, educators, and teachers make the most informed decisions about youth sport activity by exploring the relative 3 elements: physical activity, safety, and psychosocial elements of sports. And it also suggests complementary sports that kids can participate in to rest their bodies and hone different physical literacy skills that they could use for other sports. In the past year, we also released 2 additional tools that align with play number 7, which was also talked about so much this morning, in the importance of training our coaches in multiple different areas. The first, How to Coach Kids, is a 30-minute interactive online course and resource library designed for community organizations and youth sport leagues with free, accessible tools that can help the 6.3 million volunteer coaches in America. It's sport agnostic, and it was developed by Nike and the USOC in collaboration and inspired by Project Play. And forthcoming later this year, there will be additional modules that will be added to How to Coach Kids, which was launched last fall. This fall, there will be additional models built out for developmentally coaching kids at different ages, since we know they have different needs as they grow older, and one specific course on how to coach girls as well, which was also mentioned as a very important area that we need to focus on here. So those will be forthcoming in the fall. Another tool, which so many of our partners in this room, including Mo and Dan, were so instrumental in putting together, is Calls for Coaches, which is a field-facing document born out of a partnership between the Aspen Institute Sports and Society Program and the National Commission on Social, Emotional, and Academic Development. They commissioned the EASL Lab at the Harvard Graduate School of Education to synthesize the evidence behind effective youth coaching strategies and how coaches can help kids build social emotional skills through sports. There's a wealth of research to show that we know that sports are a great place to build SEL skills for kids, but how do coaches actually do that? This tool is a way that can help coaches actually understand what do those techniques look like. All of our aggregated and original research is mutually reinforced by other Project Play initiatives, including one that I manage called Project Play 2020. It's a multi-year cross-sector collaboration of 20 national leaders, which you can see here if you can see some of the smaller logos in that logo soup, including Nike, Amazon, ESPN, Target, the US Olympic Committee, USTA, NBA, MLB, and many, many others, working to grow youth sport participation rates and related metrics among youth. And this represents the first time that national cross-industry leaders have come together at the same table to develop shared goals around specific metrics. Some of the specific metrics that are at the center of Project Play 2020, which launched a few years ago, are increasing youth sport participation rates, increasing the number of youth coaches that are trained in key competencies, increasing the average number of team sports played, and also lowering the number of inactive children, or the kids who are engaged in no physical activity. And through all of these initiatives, a large part of what we do is celebrate and lift up what works in communities and also at the national level by convening people and celebrating our collective success. The main way of which we do this is through our Project Play Summit, which will take place this fall for the first time, not in Washington, D.C., but taken on the road to Detroit, Michigan, courtesy of the Ralph C. Wilson Jr. Foundation. Now in its 5th year, this is the premier gathering of leaders at the intersection of youth, sport, and health. And it's officially now integrated into 2 days of workshops, plenaries, and keynotes where we release new tools and also hear from communities what's working from them, lifting up those innovative strategies and bringing everyone together in a real moment of collaboration to continue the work forward. And we hope to see many of you there at the Project Play Summit as we continue this important conversation on how to keep kids active and healthy for life. On behalf of the Aspen Institute and our Sports and Society program, we really want to thank everyone for the opportunity to share our work with you, to continue to collaborate with all of you. There are so many of our partners that are in the room today, and we're so appreciative of the work that you do and the opportunity that we can build on this work where we can create a world where all kids are active and healthy for life. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Sarah Axelson, Senior Director of Advocacy at the Women's Sports Foundation. I'm excited to join you today, along with so many esteemed colleagues, to help inform the National Youth Sports Strategy. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the Women's Sports Foundation, we're a national nonprofit based in New York City, founded by Billie Jean King in 1974. We build on her legacy as a tennis champion, social justice pioneer, and agent of change to serve as a collective voice and catalyst for women and girls. Today, I bring you information from our collective expertise gained over our 45-year history. The work at the Women's Sports Foundation encompasses 3 main areas: research, advocacy, and community impact. While we don't offer sports programming directly, we do work with organizations who do. And in addition to today's presentation, we did submit written public comments to the priority questions listed, so I encourage you to explore those responses as well. So first, I want to take you through the current state of sports for girls. Some of it was touched on this morning, but I'll emphasize on certain points from a gender lens perspective. Research shows that girls who participate in sports have better physical and psychological health, academic outcomes, and enhanced leadership skills. And I want to emphasize the fact that these benefits last long into a woman's life. There's an ever-evolving body of research that supports the important health conclusions that a physically active lifestyle lowers the risk for a host of chronic illnesses in a woman's life, including heart disease, certain cancers, diabetes, obesity, osteoporosis, and Alzheimer's disease. And as far as enhanced leadership skills, a recent study from Ernst & Young shows that 94% of women in C-suite positions played sports throughout their life. And a majority of those women believed that sports contributed to their career success. And now many of you know that since the passage of Title IX, we've seen an exponential growth in the participation of women and girls in sports in this country. But the primary beneficiaries of those opportunities have been suburban white girls. So despite the gains that we've made, we still see that today in 2019, disparities exist for girls in sports. We see that by the age of 14, girls are dropping out of sports at twice the rate of boys. And despite Title IX being in existence, many schools still don't fully comply with the legislation. And we even see inequities in community sports programs and recreational sports programs as well. We see girls of color are especially disadvantaged as they're doubly hit by race and gender. And social and cultural barriers continue to influence access and opportunities. Other marginalized communities within the population of girls include immigrant girls, girls who are incarcerated, girls with disabilities, and urban and rural centers. So I want to take a moment to go through some of the barriers that have been identified through some of our research as prohibiting girls' access to sports. First, financial obstacles play a tremendous role. Many programs in both schools and communities, as was mentioned earlier, are moving towards a pay-to-play model, and children from socioeconomic households can often be left behind in this model. And with sports specialization at younger ages, we see travel teams becoming cost prohibitive for families. Transportation is another barrier for girls. If parents don't feel that their daughters can get safely to and from practices and games, they will often not allow her to participate in that sports experience. And they may not hold the same concerns for their sons in that same travel to sports. We see cultural barriers having an influence. Immigrant parents can often hold stereotypical views about the appropriateness of sports for girls. And we have to communicate, especially to those parents, the importance of and value of sports for their daughters. We also see the adultification of girls, the need for them to take care of the household, maybe look after younger siblings, or cook dinner. To parents, this is obviously a crucial function of the household, but it often leaves no time for girls to participate in sports. And finally, equity, or rather inequity. If girls can easily see that their sport experience is less than that of their male peers, it sends them the message that this is not a valuable experience to them, that they may not choose to participate. And for those of you who don't often look at things through a gender lens, I'm going to teach you a really easy trick on how to get a sense of whether something is equitable. Take the time, assuming it's a co-ed program, I want you to go and ask the girls if they'd be willing to trade what they have for what the boys have. Now you're going to go and ask the boys if they would be willing to trade what they have for what the girls have. If both sides say yes, I'd venture to say you have a pretty equitable program. But if only one side says yes, there's probably something going on that leads to the different boys and girls sides being inequitable. And I'd encourage you to take a look and see what can be done to enhance those programs. So what can we do to address the barriers and encourage participations? First, role models, especially female role models. This is Natasha Hastings, a track and field athlete ambassador for the Women's Sports Foundation, with a couple of girls from a Sports for Life program of ours. As Maureen mentioned earlier, we've seen a dramatic decline of women in collegiate coaching experiences, and youth sports also has a pretty woeful representation of women in coaching. But we have an entire generation of women who have been beneficiaries of Title IX and have had a robust experience with sports, and presumably still reaping those lifelong benefits that sports provides. So we need to find ways to encourage them to enter sports as coaches and volunteers so that they can become visible role models for our youth in sports, and not just our girls, but our boys too. We should strive to introduce physical literacy and a love for sports from a young age. Research shows that there's a much greater chance that adults will continue with physical activity if they're introduced to sports and physical activity at a young age as a child. We have to be intentional about recruiting girls to sports and doing so in a way that is culturally relevant and welcoming to girls. While it's often true, if you build it, they will come, sometimes you need to take the time to let certain people know that it's there for them to participate in as well. We need to properly train our coaches. I've talked about this earlier, but knowing that many of our coaches are volunteers, we need to teach them not only the skills and the X's and O's of a sport, but also the critical youth development that happens during a sport experience as well. And finally, parents. Especially at younger ages, it's the parents who make the decisions about whether or not to enroll their daughters in sports. And if a mother never had the experience herself to play sports, she may not value that experience for her daughter. We should continue to emphasize the critical role sports plays in a child's development and success throughout life. And this goes far beyond striving for a college athletic scholarship. And integrating parents into a sports experience more robustly will help them gain a firsthand view of those benefits for sports. And so briefly, I'd like to outline for you some of the Women's Sports Foundation's research reports. We have a very robust history of research reports, and for the federal folks in the rooms, we do have some folders for you that have executive summaries of these reports. For everyone, the full reports and executive summaries are available online at the Women's Sports Foundation's website. So the first report I want to touch on is Teen Sport in America, Why Participation Matters. This is a recent report from the Women's Sports Foundation, which used government data sets and examined the specific role of sports within a child's development. The main takeaways here were that the number of sports matters and that each sport brings unique health benefits and academic outcomes. So what we found was one sport is better than no sports. 2 sports are better than 1 sport, and more than 2 sports are best. And so each sport offered its own strengths in terms of things like self-esteem, academic achievement, and health outcomes. So children who played multiple sports got a combination of the benefits offered by all the sports they participated in. And I should note that we controlled for things like socioeconomic status and other things that you would assume go into some of these outcomes. The second report is Her Life Depends on It 3. As you might assume, this is the 3rd installment in this series, and is a research series that is a meta-analysis of all of the existing research on the role of sports and physical activity for girls and women in the US. The 3rd report is Go Out and Play Youth Sports in America. This is an exhaustive study of children's participation in sports and exercise, and this was the first study to document the benefits of sports to the wellness of American families. And finally, Coaching Through a Gender Lens, Maximizing Girls' Play and Potential. This is our newest research report, and I say that I mean hot off the presses, and it was just released this morning. I'm very excited to be able to share it with you today. The timing worked out. And this research examines girls' own personal experiences in sport and the degree to which specific parent coaching and program practices experience impacts girls' participation, motivation, and retention. The findings also highlight major cultural, environmental, and policy barriers that contribute to the gender gap in sport, and the ways in which youth sports organizations serving girls can successfully meet the needs of girls to foster their continued engagement. So how can we improve the sports landscape in the US? First, it's critical that we engage with community leaders and youth in a continued dialogue so that we can learn from those on the ground and the communities about what is needed and how those of us on a national level can help. We can also encourage partnerships between federal government, elected officials, local, regional, and national sports organizations to really work collectively to move that needle. Second, we should continue to expand funding and capacity in building initiatives for community programs. And this is especially for those who serve the most marginalized girls, girls of color, girls with disabilities. Collaborations are critical here, and the Women's Sports Foundation does have funding and capacity building initiatives that we engage in as well. Data collection. The government could expand existing data collection efforts so that we can gain a deeper and more robust understanding of sports access and opportunities and the benefits that they provide. And finally, we should continue to expand efforts to research how sports influence youth while segmenting that research by relevant subgroups to better understand the individual experience. The Women's Sports Foundation looks forward to continuing to work toward increasing access and opportunities for youth in sports. And we're pleased to have today's presentation serve as a starting point to serve as a resource to HHS as you develop the National Youth Sports Strategy. Thank you very much for your time today and having the opportunity to speak. I'll turn it over to Russell.
Well, it's really very nice to be here today. Let me start by being direct. I think what we're doing today and with this project is really important. I think one of the key approaches that we can and do use in enhancing public health in the U.S. is identifying important platforms, existing resources that we can either build on, tweak, modify, and then apply broadly for better outcomes. I see youth sport as a huge enterprise in the U.S. I think it qualifies as one of those platforms that if we better use it and apply it for public health outcomes can be very effective. And of course, the one that I'm particularly interested in is physical activity and the health outcomes that we know are associated with it. My view, before I launch into my formal presentation, is having been around youth sport for a long time in one capacity or another, I think physical activity has been sort of implicitly connected to youth sport for a long time. I think it's always been there, sort of in the background. I think there's been an assumption that if kids are engaged in youth sport, they're probably going to be pretty physically active, maybe active enough to provide health benefits, but that's where I think the assumptions break down. And so a lot of what I'm going to say here really is about what I think we can do to better use the youth sport platform to provide and promote physical activity in kids and such that they will ultimately gain the health benefits that we know are associated with that activity. So a little brief background here. I'm primarily here today to speak about the National Physical Activity Plan, which I will get to here momentarily. But I am an academic. My day job is at the University of South Carolina, where I have a group that studies physical activity in kids. And so I couldn't resist the temptation to lay a little bit of groundwork. It was my honor to serve on the Physical Activity Guidelines Advisory Committee, where my main focus was to chair the youth subcommittee. And as was reported earlier, we concluded that there are very important health benefits associated with higher levels of physical activity in kids. And they include, as indicated here, better bone health. In an era in which we're dealing with a huge obesity epidemic, I think it's very important that we were able to conclude that more active kids are less likely to gain excessive weight and ultimately become overweight and obese. More active kids are fitter, have better cardiometabolic health, and an innovation in this iteration of the guidelines was the conclusion that there are benefits to cognition and brain health in kids and reduced risk of depression. And consequently, there are now guidelines for kids, and they were stated earlier, so I won't take the time to do it, but basically we think kids should be active at the moderate to vigorous intensity levels for an hour a day, and within that context, regularly engage in vigorous intensity physical activity, in bone strengthening and muscle strengthening activities. Others have pointed out, and I will again before I finish, that there's a lot that we still need to learn about the importance of sport in providing healthful physical activity for kids. But let's not pretend we don't know anything. We know something. I think we do know that, as indicated in this study where physical activity was objectively measured in kids, that on days when kids are involved in sport, that sport participation can represent a quite substantial percentage of their overall activity on that day. And our group's been interested. This is not yet published, but I hope will be before long. You know, we've been doing a longitudinal study of physical activity in kids, and these are data as kids transition from middle school to high school. And what we find is that kids engaged in sport at both 7th grade and 9th grade are more physically active than kids who are not reporting participation in sport. And so we think it tracks. You know, we think there's a longitudinal relationship here. And of course, what that points to is the importance of you know, trying to overcome the huge dropout from youth sport that we know has been a problem in this area for a long time. But let me get on to the National Physical Activity Plan, which Mo was kind enough to plug earlier in her presentation. I'm not going to assume that everybody here knows a lot about the national plan, although I know some of you do. It's managed by an organization called the National Physical Activity Plan Alliance, which is a coalition of around 25 national organizations, some of whom are represented in the room here today. This organization came together as an informal coalition beginning around 2007, 2008. Developed the initial National Physical Activity Plan that was released in 2010. Subsequent to that release, the organization decided that it needed to live on, and a not-for-profit 501c3 National Physical Activity Plan Alliance was formed at that point. A National Physical Activity Plan, or a plan, is a comprehensive set of strategies that include policies, practices, and initiatives aimed at increasing physical activity in all segments of the population. And as Mo mentioned, our current plan is organized around 9 societal sectors. I will point out that when we developed the first plan that was released in 2010, it was organized around 8 sectors. Sport was not one of them. And I think it was not very long before we figured out that was an inappropriate oversight, and we corrected it when the updated plan was developed for release in 2016. I've highlighted 4 of the sectors that I'm going to draw from here in my presentation today. If the plan is anything, it's detailed and comprehensive. That's probably a double-edged sword. We don't really expect anybody to go home and do it all, but I very much hope that there is something in there for almost everybody that's interested in physical activity and its promotion. And I certainly think that there are many strategies and tactics in the plan that apply quite directly to the issue that we're here concerned about today. So overall, there are 50 strategies, 264 tactics, and a very large number of objectives under the tactics. So I know my federal colleagues know a lot about the national plan, and I don't need to tell you to go read it because I know you've already read it. But I don't have time today to go down into the weeds to the level that I think would be appropriate as you do the work that you're about here. So I'm going to give, very much a cherry-picked overview of what's in the plan that I think bears on this project. But I do hope that that there will be a more granular review of the plan that would be undertaken and applied as this project moves forward. So I am going to highlight a few strategies that are in the selected sectors of the plan that I mentioned. The first obvious one is sport. One strategy is that sport organizations should collaborate to establish a national policy that emphasizes the importance of sports as a vehicle for promoting and sustaining a physically active population. That's the point I was making earlier. I think this has been there in the background for a long time. This strategy says, let's get it in the headline. Okay, let's commit ourselves to using sport as a public health means for increasing physical activity in the U.S. population. Next, leaders in multiple sectors should expand access to recreational spaces and quality sports programming. I was up here earlier this week in a session, part of which was dealing with applications of civil rights law to prevention of obesity. Let's face it, we can play hardball when we decide to do it. Now, we haven't done it with this issue yet, but, you know, at least not directly as we're discussing it here. But I think we could, and heaven knows, if you look across our, you know, our communities, our states and localities, there are huge disparities in access to the facilities that are used in engaging in sport. And we have the capacity, if we're committed, to addressing those disparities. Next, public health agencies, in collaboration with sports organizations, should develop and implement a comprehensive surveillance system for monitoring sports participation. I'm going to come back to this one, you know, sort of a principle in public health that you deal with the problems that you measure, that you monitor with surveillance systems. And there are some promising developments in this area that I'll come back to in a bit. Next, coaches, game officials, parents, and caregivers should create safe and inclusive environments for sports participation. And again, let me remind you, under these strategies, there are multiple tactics and objectives that could be applied. In the education sector, a couple that I think apply here are providers of after-school, holiday, and vacation programs for children and youth should adopt policies and practices that ensure that participants are appropriately physically active. We cannot any longer assume that if they get there, and of course, getting them there is a big part of the challenge as well, but we can't assume that if they get there, they're necessarily going to be highly physically active. I think we know enough about this issue to know that sometimes they are and sometimes they aren't. In addition, educational institutions can do more. You know, we need more like, you know, Dan's and Mo's institutions that really focus on this issue and provide important professional training. And we can certainly diffuse that, I think, across the country. In the community recreation, fitness, and parks sector, communities should develop new and enhance existing community recreation, fitness, and park programs that provide and promote healthy physical activity. Again, you know, I think our partners in the parks and recreation field would acknowledge that we can do better in terms of promoting high levels of physical activity in kids who are engaged in the programs that are provided by these important agencies. Communities should improve availability of and access to safe, clean, and affordable community recreation, fitness, and parks facilities. Alluded to this one already. You know, across the country, faith-based organizations are huge providers of youth. Part of the world where I live, they are major providers of youth sport programming, and I think have tended to operate pretty independently. And I think part of what we probably want to do is build collaborations. So one strategy is physical activity and public health organizations should partner with faith-based organizations in developing and delivering physical activity programs that are accessible and tailored to diverse audiences. And if you would like to know more about the plan, you can learn more than you ever wanted to at physicalactivity.org. So again, I'm not shy. I'm not happy to have been asked to make some recommendations here, so I'm going to make some. You know, we could move this issue along, I think, by creating a more robust surveillance system so that we really know what's going on out there in states and communities across the country. And we don't now. Let's not pretend that we do. I know we know something, but we don't know it the way we need to know it. I'm pleased to tell you, and I know a few folks in the room know this and have been engaged in the project, but in just a few months, the National Academies of Medicine is going to release a report on steps that we can take to create a more robust surveillance system for physical activity in this country, and it will include recommendations for children, and it will, in that section, will include recommendations that relate to community-based programming, such as youth sport. So hopefully that report can be a catalyst that'll, you know, help us make advances here. Second, I think we could fund state and local agencies and nonprofit organizations to test innovative programs to enhance equity and expand access to youth sports programs. We know they're great programs. We're going to have heard about and are going to hear about more very creative programs here today. They're out there, but I think we could study them in a controlled, systematic manner and learn a lot. I think we can fund research aimed at identifying the factors that influence sport participation in youth. Folks like Dan and Mo have been studying these issues for a long time. I think it's time to bring to bear the federal funding paradigm to these issues, and I think the issues warrant it. I think if we're interested in public health, there's no reason why we can't make the case that studying this modality for promoting physical activity isn't of high priority. So I hope that will happen. And I think we should establish policies that will ensure that local governments provide equitable access to sports facilities and programs for youth. We know the inequities exist. We tolerate them. We shouldn't tolerate them. We should address that issue because it's very hard for kids to be involved in healthful physical activity through sport participation when it's not even safe for them to go out and access the place where they would do that. And others have alluded to Title IX, and I'm first to acknowledge that probably hasn't been perfectly addressed up to this point, but in my lifetime, I'd be hard-pressed to think of legislative initiatives that have had a more deep impact on our society than this one. It's huge. It's just huge. And, it calls for equity and programming, gender equity for programming and educational settings in particular. And, those two lines haven't come together. I think there are reasons why they haven't. But my God, that red line is way ahead of where it was when I was a kid. And what I think this says is, when we take an issue seriously, by God, we can deal with it. Title IX is not a recommendation. It's not a guideline. It's not encouragement. It says this is what will happen, and we're going to enforce it. And we have enforced it, not perfectly, but I was the faculty athletic rep at the University of South Carolina for a few years. I got to learn a lot about how universities attempt to comply with Title IX and other federal regulations. It's a serious business, they don't ignore it because they know there's a hammer there. And so I think, this is, I think, historically one of the huge initiatives in the whole physical activity public health area. I often say, I don't think we could pretend to count the minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity that girls and women in this country have gotten over the last 40 years as a result of Title IX. So it's been, from my perspective, a huge public health initiative, and I hope we'll do more of this sort of thing. So thank you very much.
Okay, this is your opportunity to ask our panelists questions. And so once again, we will first 5 minutes for federal staff, and then we'll open it to the rest of the audience. Okay? Kate.
Hi, Kate Olskamp from the Office of Disease Prevention and Health Promotion, and I have a question for Sarah. One of your slides, you talked about culturally relevant recruiting, and I assume that you're talking about that both from participants and from coaches. So I was just wondering if you have any specific examples of what that might look like.
I mean, I think to some extent it's about, especially for girls, for participants, it's about meeting them where they are, right? So just because the sports program is available doesn't mean that they might join it. So what are they interested in? Where are they congregating if they're not in sports? And how can you go to them and talk to them about sports in a way that attracts them into that programming?
Okay. Francis down here.
Hi, I'm Frances Bevington with ODPHP, and my question is actually also for Sarah. Sorry. We looked into barriers to physical activity leading up to the release of the latest edition of the guidelines, and one of the things that we were really surprised about by youth was how much stress they were reporting as a barrier. And in your presentation, you mentioned that 3+ sports is better. Did you find an upper limit to that, where kind of the performance stress kind of outweighed the benefits from sports?
So if I recall correctly, I believe that the way the data set is positioned, it's just more than 2. So it doesn't actually delineate if it's 3 or 5 or however many sports it is. But that report is really interesting because it looks at all of the aspects of a sport and how the athletes perform on things like academic outcomes, self-esteem, also health risk behaviors. So there are some places where sports have room for improvement. And so those, we can look at that and see maybe there are certain sports that don't do as well in certain categories, but there are sports who do well in those same categories. So what can we learn and what can we translate from one sport to another to enhance the sport experience for all athletes?
Hi, Katie Adamson from the Y. I'm just wondering to what extent your research bridges the gap between sports and recreation, because with canoeing, hiking, all of those other activities, we're doing a lot of leadership programs around outdoor recreation with diverse populations because there's another equity gap there. And so I'm just wondering to what extent we see that as potential on-ramps into sports or sports as on-ramps into recreation, and how do we make sure we're researching that too, because there's a lot of groups out there who would want to be part of this as well, like the Outdoors Alliance for Kids. And so I just bring it up as an issue. I think it's relevant, and I'm just wondering if your groups are looking at that.
I'll take it, and then if you have anything from Aspen. So I would say one thing from our research is that some of it does look at physical activity and some of the others, and we see that girls are moving towards some of what they consider others, whether it's skateboarding or things that are considered non-traditional sports. So that's certainly included in our research. But some of it is about the data sets that are collected and what questions are asked in that data and the existing data. So I think that that's a good call to action to make sure that we're looking at not just traditional sports, but also looking at what is right now probably considered more generally an other, and we can look at that in a little bit more detail.
Absolutely. And I'll just add on in terms of different partnerships to engage in, like Project Play 2020, where we're bringing multiple folks to the table. We also do engage with a lot of with other industries, and including I just had a conversation with Jessica Jessica Wall from the Outdoor Recreation Roundtable, and wasn't read up on this beforehand, but I know that the recent passage of the Public Lands Package with the Every Kid Outdoors Act, you're nodding, so I'm getting it right, was hugely instrumental in so much of their work in terms of talking about how do we work with folks to get kids outside and recognizing those other on-ramps other than sport and recreation, exactly what that looks like. And so I think from the perspective of being a convener like the Aspen Institute is, what that tells us to do is to continually be engaging partners in the park and rec, in the outdoor industry areas. We had a great conversation about how other folks in the boating and fishing industry were working to get girls into fly fishing and what they faced in efforts like that. And so to me, at least from our role, it's about looking out as conveners and saying, where are those folks, bringing them to the table, and also tracking those important federal policy initiatives that come through and saying, how does that align with what we're doing? How do we all work together to further that?
I'd like to chime in here. I think this is an important point. The Europeans use the word sport differently than we use it. And we tend to think of competitive teams and that sort of thing. I can't prove this, but I just had the graph up there showing the change in participation of boys and girls, men and women, in sport, over the last 40, 50 years. I'll point out that not all boys participate, right? Lots of them do not, and we haven't closed the gap, between males and females, and my speculation is that one reason we haven't is that we have tended to operationalize our programming around activities that draw in certain kinds of kids that like certain kinds of activities, and have tended to leave out kids that might well engage in an organized program that would provide important levels of physical activity, but which are not typically available on our menu of activities. So I do think one thing I hope the department will consider is maybe a broader, more inclusive operational definition of sport.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Melissa Otterbein. I'm with George Washington University Department of Exercise Science. My question is for you, Russell. I was interested and appreciated that you mentioned surveillance. I was curious if you saw this as inclusion in currently existing tools to, such as WiredBS, or would you see this as a fresh way to capture new data using a new tool set or something like that?
Yeah, the latter. So Rick's here. He knows we know how to measure physical activity in kids at the population level, and there are probably things that we could do better and differently, but that's not the big gap. The gap is in knowing in a systematic way across the country where the resources are that we believe would importantly help us influence activity participation in kids. So what would we hope, and I think will be recommended in this National Academy of Medicine document that will be released in a few months, is the recommendation that we build into our existing surveillance systems more that would tell us about access to physical activity programming for people in general, not just kids, but across the board, as well as their access to the other resources, green spaces, parks, so on, that are undoubtedly influential in terms of people's physical activity participation.
Do you have additional questions?
Brad Hatfield, University of Maryland, Kinesiology. Russ, I'd like to reinforce something you said about the federal funding model. What I've seen in our field over a period of about 30 years is really such an emphasis on physical activity that in many ways I think we have kind of turned our back on sport as a vehicle for health. And as someone who grew up in Canada, I can also tell you that even with elite sport and the promotion of it, which happened with the Canadian government, it formed a system of role models, I would say, that then stimulated participation at the grassroots level. And I think that the federal funding model is very key to this because everything has been in terms of physical activity and health or overcoming the lack of health with disease populations. And I think we've kind of missed the boat on the notion of something that is innately interesting and motivating to people to engage in, which gets them to move and then generates lifelong values.
So thanks for saying that, because it gives me an opportunity to make a point that I like to make. I think we know we struggle in communicating with the public when we use the term physical activity, right? Because let's face it, it's kind of vague, and I don't think people, very many of them think of themselves as engaging in physical activity. I think they think of themselves as engaging in a specific form of physical activity or some constellation of forms of physical activity. And if you ask them, they might say, well, I'm a physically active person, or if they respond to a survey, they might sort of indicate that, but I don't think that's what they identify with. I think they identify with, they go for a walk after dinner, or they play tennis, or they engage in specific forms of activity. So I think if we're going to talk to the public about being more active, we've got to talk to them in terms that people can understand and identify with, not vague terms that, for those of us in academia or, federal agencies and so on, we need to think of it that way, but not necessarily when we're communicating with the public about these issues.
Dan?
A question for Russ. One of your first recommendations was sort of like intervention studies for good programs. In the physical activity setting where there's a lot more research in public health, is there much data on the sustainability after these interventions have, the funding's run out and they're proven effective? I guess it goes back to REAIM, some of the others. How much are we moving the bar like 10 years later if there was a program in Atlanta done? Do you find the program still there?
Yeah, we don't know much about that. I am very pleased that, we now have something called implementation science, right? That's sort of a developing field, that I think in time is going to help us better understand, how to take products of research and scale them up and implement them on a broader, with broader reach. But, I'll be the last one that would criticize the NIH funding model because it's been pretty good to me. But we all know it has its limitations, right? I mean, there would be merit in more of the the control trials that get done promoting activity to smoothly transition into an implementation dissemination phase. And I do think that's something that the field needs to try to effect over time. It's more of that.
One more question.
Have uses in measuring sport and physical activity. So have any of you looked at that? Where are we going with that? And I'll be happy to share the results.
Well, I think there's a lot of interest in trying to figure out how we can take advantage from a research and evaluation perspective. All of the self-selected biometry that's going out there, and how we can better apply, some of that to research advantage. It's not entirely straightforward, I think many people are trying to think about how can we use all of that in a surveillance mode. How can we better use it in research? And I wouldn't want to say it isn't going to happen, but I'm not sure that we necessarily are there yet in terms of figuring out how best to apply some of these technologies that are developing very rapidly in our society.
And one quick thing, actually, so that I would add on to that is what's interesting to me about that question about using new technologies to gather data also ties to the question that was asked earlier about surveillance and how we're collecting data. And Russ and others have mentioned, a lot of these studies or data is being collected in schools or in other traditional places where kids are. And we know that kids are active in so many different places, in faith-based organizations, in out-of-school time programs. And so I think what's interesting about that question is that as we look at different places to collect data, different ways to collect data, also being able to say, are there different means of collecting that data that would work better in non-traditional educational settings, especially with the advent of technology and social media and other things. There are questions around that, and especially as you start getting into surveying youth and doing other things like that. But I think if we're thinking about changing how we collect data, as we're looking at different places where we're collecting data is a strong way to start.
Okay, thank you, Emily, Sarah, and Russ. Okay, I have a couple of housekeeping things before you go. We will reconvene promptly at 1:15. We have Michelle, Kate, Felix, and Kyle. Will you raise your hands? These are the folks that are available to escort our non-federal guests to lunch. There's a cafeteria upstairs, and they will take you there. Any guest who chooses to leave the building for lunch, we ask that you be at security no later than 1 o'clock, because we want to start on time, and someone will meet you there, okay? And one last thing, I want to remind our non-traditional programming panelists, if you could be in the green room by 1:05, that would be great. Have a great lunch.
Produced by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services at taxpayer expense.